Hi, I'm Seamless, and today is Tuesday, which means it's time for a new FL Basics tutorial. This one is a continuation in the series on Harmor. This is going to be about the effects that are in Harmor over here on this effects tab. So these effects that are built into Harmor are all post effects. That is to say, they are applied to the output of the additive synthesis of Harmor. These are not additive effects. Like everything else in Harmor, like the filters and the phaser and the prism and all that, are additive processes that are being applied to the harmonics as you play them. But these effects in this actual effects window are audio effects, basically. They're not unlike the ones that you will find in FL Studio anyway. So we get fairly obvious ones. We have distortion, chorus, delay, and reverb, and compression, and they all have these are all very basic things. Like they're not designed to be super duper amazing, wonderful, incredible, except that like I will say that the distortion that's available through this distortion module is pretty freaking sweet. So let's go through these and we'll see what they do. So distortion, it's pretty straightforward. You have a bunch of various types. Now, I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure that the distortion in Harmor is based around things that you can do with the wave shaper anyway. Again, I could be wrong about that. So first, I'm going to actually make something that's worth distorting. That should be fine. And then sounds neat. The various types of distortion they do sound different. Like there's log, there's cube, flat hat, hill. It's not just that they sound different, but they also behave differently when you change things, like the amplitude and the asymmetry and all that stuff. Like if I, for example, low passed it and then log distorted it, makes pretty sense. And then if I go to the cube, that sounds a bit different. Different still with hill. One thing the hill does is if you play something that's square in nature and use hill, it'll actually sort of sound. It's a bit difficult to tell with straight tones like that. You can get kind of a low tone feel out of it. Anyway, it's pretty super duper straightforward. In terms of like the types, they just sound different. Just mess with them, you learn what they sound like. Your amount is basically straightforward. It's like no distortion, all distortion. The asymmetry is fun, and what this does is it introduces asymmetry to the distortion. It has a top and a bottom, and the top is mono and the bottom is stereo. So that could be kind of a good way to introduce stereo to a sound, as I would recommend it part of other stereo processes. Like if you want to add in panning here, and then also, like, you know, it feels a little bit more balanced than if you would just use one or the other by themselves. It has the wet values, which is just how a lot of distortion is. Notice how that basically turns the sound off, and that's because the mix value is set into the center. As we approach one side, like up here, it's basically 100% positive, and over here it's 100% negative. Both will actually bring down the distortion's effect to 0. But if you bring distortion to minus 50, what you're actually hearing there is only the distortion, which you might be thinking, well, what does that mean? Because if you hear it, that's still distorted. It's distorted, but the original signal is actually still involved in the sound in there. If you do negative 50, what that basically means is that we're phase canceling out the original signal. And so you get only distortion. This can be useful for lots of interesting applications, but I won't be talking about them today. And over here we have the filter knob, which by default is set like a little bit down here. It's right there actually. And what that does is it's filter. It's just a low pass filter, and that's because most distortion settings tend to introduce a lot of high frequency action, which might not be desirable for certain applications. So the filter is up there. I usually bring it all the way up because if I want to remove high frequency action, I will usually do so in post for EQ. That's pretty much it for the distortion. I turn it on and off by selecting a mode, turns it on, and selecting off, turns it off. Over on the chorus, we have over here we have a drop down menu, which actually gives us various presets, and you might recognize these if you've ever used the Flanges, I guess, Flanges, whatever. It's a FL plugin. I'm going to show it to you. Doink. And if you see the presets, oh, it actually looks kind of like the same thing, more or less. And that's because it's basically the Flanges is built into Harmor. And we have the same options. We have how many voices, or order, I suppose. We have depth, speed, which is how fast they modulates, delay, spread, and crossover, which determines the stereoization of the sound, and then mix. And over here we have the same positive and negative interaction with the mix as we did with the distortion. Although by default it's set up to 50%, and if we turn it all the way off, or all the way to center, we actually get it off completely. Then if you had negative 50%, then we're getting just the chorus sound without any of the wet involved. So that's what that does. Turn the chorus on and off by turning on the voices. Without the voices, it's off. So that's how you turn that on. Over here we have reverb with some presets also involved. This is pretty straightforward. It has a tone control between super bright and super warm. Got size control, delay. Delay that can be measured in beats, tempo syncing up here. And then down here is milliseconds. And then we have a filter. High frequency. This is a low pass. This is a high pass. It's got diffusion, size, decay, and dampening. And the same 100% minus 100% wet level settings as the other plugins, the other effects modules, I should say. You turn this on and off by clicking on this little button over here. This can be automated, which is nice. Most of these parameters can be automated. Then over here you have delay. Works pretty much the same as your normal delay plugins. This is the delay input volume. The delay only outputs the wet value because the dry value is also being output through the main Harmor anyway. It's got positive and negative input value, and that's pretty much what determines whether or not those wet or dry. But like I said, there's basically only wet, and if you have this on 0, it's not going to put out anything, and you can put out negative or positive phase input values. And you can also pan the input. And when you have it set to ping pong, it'll pinging around. You can also do it inverted. Or normal. And then we can leave it in the center just for normal settings. And you also have the same filter setup as the reverb does. Feedback amount. Set feedback dampening on. And then time controls where we have either synced beats or milliseconds for delay. And then we have stereo offset. Yeah. And then last on the list of effects, we have the compressor. So it has a bunch of settings. It's off by default. And then the first one, limiting, these knobs you see aren't lit up. Whether they're not lit up yet. So if I turn it to warming, they light up. It's because limiting basically crunches it off at 0 dB, like a limiter would. It brick walls everything. So even if I were to turn the pre effects way up, it won't actually go above 0 dB. But the other options are basically varying degrees of harder compression. Now, this is a multi-band compressor, so it has amount, and you basically can control band amounts with low, mid, and high. This is great for if you're using, like, for example, you're doing bass resampling, like I do a lot, and the resampling tends to pick a band and then destroy it. That's what it'll do. It'll remove some things from the sound you might not want removed. And you could use a compressor to bring some of that back selectively using the bands. So that's pretty handy, and I use that a lot. And you typically just put it on burning because it likes to be nice and compressed. So that's pretty much just pretty straightforward use of the effects. But one thing that we can do with the effects is if we go to the advanced tab, we have the effects order. And over here, this controls the stack of the effects. By default, distortion is first, then chorus, then delay, reverb, dry mix, which as you can see, you can move around anywhere. And then the compressor is last. But you can change this. As you can see, I just move it around. Like I can put that, I can put basically all of this before distortion. You know, turn distortion on. And you can have a lot of fun with that. A lot of sounds you can make with Harmor, and you can just put on some of these very basic effects, because these are very basic effects, and you can get the job done without really having to go outside of Harmor. Of course, I mean, there's no audio EQ, which I wish there kind of was. I guess you can use the multi-band compressor to kind of do that. Just have a sort of 3-band kind of EQ thing going on. But most of the time, some of the things that I do anyway require post EQ. But for a lot of things, sometimes that's not really required. Like if you want a little bit of reverb, you get a little bit of reverb. You get delay, you get chorus, distortion. Harmor's distortion is pretty awesome. It's a lot of fun and responsible for lots of coolness that I do with Harmor. Yeah, I believe that covers everything that's necessary to be talking about in terms of the effects. So if you have any questions about that, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.